Warm greetings, everyone. It is a delight and a real privilege to have the opportunity to be one of the presenters at this year's Asia Pacific Regional Early Childhood Conference. I'm James Cairns, the Senior Director for Strategic Engagements and Organizational Learning at the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard University. And I want to extend my thank you to the RNEC team, to your partners and supporters who've made this conference possible. And again, I'm just grateful for the invitation and the opportunity to be with you. As we get ready to move into the theme of this conference over the next several days, looking at how the combined and overlapping crises of COVID-19, climate change, and environmental degradation are affecting the lives and developmental prospects of young children across the region, and in fact, in so many places around the world. There will be many other presenters and sessions that will focus on deep experience and research and evidence around those specific challenges of those crises and effects on children. What I want to do in my time is to take a broader look at what is it that's happening in early development when children are faced with these kinds of crises, and to draw on some key insights that we know from that science of early development that can be both lenses for how you look at these issues more specifically over the coming days and in your ongoing work, and how these insights can also offer us some strategies and approaches to support healthy development. And so as we dive into this presentation, it is my opportunity and pleasure to frame this around the idea of resilience and how these insights from science that talk about how we build resilience can offer support for maximizing healthy development in the context of the particular crises that this conference is focused on, and in fact, any kind of crisis or adversity that are facing young children and their families. And so when we talk about resilience and the science of resilience, what do we mean by this? And I want to just a couple of basic parts of this concept and what we know as a framework for how we move forward in this presentation. So first, a definition. There are many, but I think this one is as good as any for us in our purposes today. When we talk about resilience, we're talking about how an individual can achieve good outcomes in the face of significant hardship and adversity, and acknowledging that there is variability here. And so we are trying to understand what is it that helps a particular child or a family or even a community overcome and get to good results. Importantly, resilience is built over time. It's not a trait. And I think too often we can think of resilience as either someone is resilient or they are not. And that's not what the science tells us, that this is something that is built over time, and in particular, in the interaction between the protective factors in our environments and our own individual biological systems and how responsive they are. And what we're looking at is a combination of supportive relationships, adaptive skill building, and positive experiences that form the foundation for resilience. And we can think about this as a scale. And that what we're looking at is, the piling up of negative and positive experiences and how that can tip an individual towards either negative or positive outcomes in a particular situation or over the life course. And there are a variety of things that sort of are building blocks or can add to sort of the positive side. and a couple of them, and I'm going to touch on these a little bit more in detail in a minute, but things like responsive relationships, building a sense of mastery or agency, that a child feels like they have control over certain kinds of things, what kinds of supports exist in the community surrounding children and families, and something perhaps we don't often focus on, at least when we talk about science, but rich evidence around how faith and cultural traditions are also very important building blocks towards positive outcomes. And so we want to think about how can we maximize what's on the positive side, reduce what's on the negative side. But it's not just about experience. As I said earlier, it's about the interaction between these experiences and our own biological systems and our genetic predispositions. And so the key part of that in this story and in this scale metaphor is the fulcrum. And so this is set differently, and depending on where it is on the scale, it can make it easier or harder for it to tip in the negative or positive direction. Each of us, everyone who is listening to my voice, all of us have this fulcrum point set differently. This is where genetics come in. Each of us has a different temperament, a different sensitivity to our environments, and that's part of what sets the fulcrum. But the good news, and what we know from the science, is that where it starts is not a fixed, permanently position. And so we can, through building and strengthening adaptive skills, self-regulation capacities, and so forth, shift the fulcrum. And so what we're learning is that we can build resilience and increase the odds of reaching positive outcomes by strengthening these skills. And if you think about any of us in our individuals and how we respond to stress or adversity and our sensitivity to that, often we learn coping skills. We develop practices that enable us to cope with those situations, to find ways to work through them, and to achieve the kind of positive results. Those are the kinds of skills we're talking about. And each of us in our own ways, as we've navigated our lives, have had to do that. So let's come to those sort of building blocks that were on that scale. So this idea of importance of facilitating responsive, stable, caring relationships between adults and children. And then that environment of relationships is foundational for a lot of development, including building resilience. Second, what I just talked about, how are we strengthening these adaptive skills, these self-regulatory capacities in children so that they are able to address and cope with challenging situations. Increasing this idea and this sense of mastery or agency. Do we feel like we have competence? Are we confident that we can do certain things, achieve certain kinds of results? We have certain kinds of skills, and that confidence and that sense of agency is an important element of achieving a resilient outcome. And then finally, as I was mentioning, drawing on these faith and cultural traditions in our particular contexts. And part of what the research is showing here is that these traditions do a couple of things. They are places where communities gather, where they tell stories of how over time that particular culture or faith community has weathered adversity. It talks about hope, talks about perseverance across generations, and that these kinds of values, this kind of experience is a really important and positive factor that helps individuals be able to be resilient in the face of adversity and crisis. Now, across all of these, I want to come back to this idea of the importance of community supports. one of the risks as we talk about resilience in these kinds of ways is it can make it sound like it's up to a family or an individual child to sort of foster this kind of resilience in the face of structural, systemic crises and adversities that are not their responsibility individually. And so how we are able to bring services and supports in the communities around families and children that give them what they need to be able to practice and build these kinds of factors is a critical part of how we should understand resilience and not inadvertently put all of that burden back onto individual kids and families. Now, what I want to do is to shift and look at some of the really critical sort of scientific concepts or insights that are underneath these kinds of building blocks. So the first is that these responsive relationships and early experience are foundational in shaping the architecture of the brain. The brain is constructed through a process that begins even before birth and continues into adulthood, where the brain is wiring itself based on its exposure and experience in the world and in the environments in which a child and each of us is living and growing up. Simple circuits built first as a core foundation, and then more complex things built on top of that. So think of it as building a house. Strong foundation, a sturdy architecture and frame allows for more complex circuits. All of this is happening in the interaction between a baby and a young child and the caregivers and adults, and those relationships and how responsive they are. One of the reasons why we emphasize early as so important is the concept of brain plasticity. And so that the ability of the brain to change and adapt and shape that architecture decreases over time. And so this is sort of a natural part of how the brain actually helps become more efficient. And so at birth and in those early years, there's sort of a maximal plasticity or adaptability as those circuits are getting wired. Over time, the brain's getting more specialized. It's reinforcing those kinds of connections and skills that it's using, and what it's not using, it's kind of pruning away. And so as things get more specialized, it just becomes harder to rewire, to create adaptive or different kinds of connections. And so over time, that effort, the physiological effort, the kind of whatever energy the brain and body need to use to wire, the cost, all go up, and the results get less good. The brain is incredibly adaptive, but over time, that effort is harder, it costs more, and the results aren't going to be as good as if we had done this work early. So excessive stress, and what we've talked about as toxic stress, can disrupt the development of the brain architecture, these connections, these capacities, as well as other systems in the body. Toxic stress has gotten a lot of attention as a term we all use in the field now. I think sometimes we forget that it's part of three types of understanding aspects of the stress response system. And so it's important to say not all stress is bad. Learning how to cope with stress is a critical part of healthy development. And so positive stress is sort of building on up a healthy stress response system. For young children, this can be things like being forced to take a nap, sharing toys, having to go to a doctor's appointment or to preschool class or something like that, anything that is disrupting and creating kind of stress or anxiety. But with caregivers around, those kind of brief elevations of that system then get calmed down, and that's part of building a healthy stress response system. For more serious stressors, and the ones and the kinds of crises that this conference is focusing on would very much fall in this area. The effects of climate change, the impact of COVID as a pandemic, displacement, by conflict, by environmental challenges or catastrophes, very serious stressors that are happening over a longer period of time. But again, it's the buffering impact of those supportive, caregiving, secure relationships with adult that allow that stress response system to kind of calm down and be able to manage and not have serious negative effects over a longer period of time. Now, when these periods and situations of high stress and adversity are prolonged and unrelenting, and there's an absence of that supportive adult caregiving relationship, that's when we start to get into this situation where we talk about toxic stress. So there are a lot of things that can cause this, but the critical thing is this persisting elevated stress response over time without that caregiving support that allows that system to calm down. And when we talk about prolonged, we're not talking about a week or a month. This is week after week, month after month, where the system is kind of elevating and creating toxicity among hormones and other things in the body and in the brain. And so to think about this is we've been talking about toxic stress in the context of brain development and sort of cognitive and learning outcomes and behavior and so forth. But what we are learning increasingly is what's true for the brain is true for the rest of the body, and that these systems are highly interrelated. And so these things have huge implications for health as well as for learning. And so when we talk about the stress that happens and the stress response, the body is a team of highly skilled athletes, each with their own role, but responding to each other, largely coordinated through the brain. But we talk about the heart and cardiovascular system, the metabolic system, the immune system, the neuroendocrine system, all of which are regulating different kinds of biological responses in the context of responding to threat and stress. And so this system is designed to kick in and deal with short-term threat. It's not designed to stay on and stay elevated all the time. You think of like a car running its engine all the time, over time. And so what we have to understand is if all of these systems are stressed over time, it has that kind of corrosive effect in our body. And so as we think about our work in early childhood, supporting families and young children is just as important for building foundations for lifelong physical and mental health as it is about early learning and other kinds of development. And if we think about the kind of chronic disease burdens that are increasingly straining many of our societies around the world in terms of cost, in terms of poor life and health outcomes, many of these are tied to how elevated and persistent stress affects these systems in terms of things like inflammation, excessive glucose, these hormonal levels and so forth. So if you think about things like cardiovascular disease, diabetes, depression, hypertension, many of these are tied back to things like persistent and ongoing inflammation in our bodies. And so there are early foundations that we need to pay attention and have opportunities to address in terms of health outcomes as well as for learning and behavior. Turning to one of our other core sort of building blocks of resilience, this idea of adaptive skills and capabilities that help us kind of across all parts of our life: work, economy, school, parenting, and so forth. Again, these are built over time and through practice. And so we can call these executive self-regulation kinds of skills, but they're the capacities that help us focus and sustain attention, set goals, make plans, make decisions and problem solve. If plan A doesn't work, can we figure out what plan B would be? And the kind of controlling our impulses, delaying gratification, following rules, that sort of planful, and so on. And we like to think of these as a kind of an air traffic control system in the brain. If you think about the way that a major airport manages the landing and taking off of hundreds of airplanes, that These are skills and capacities that help each of us manage lots of information that's coming in and going out, making sense of it, and figuring out how we make decisions and take action. And these skills are not exclusively, but heavily sort of centered in the prefrontal cortex of the brain and have the longest period of time for development because they require so much interconnection in different areas. And so there's a foundational period in infancy, but one of the sort of major areas of plasticity for these skills happens in the 3 to 5 year old sort of window. If you think about, in a preschool setting or a daycare setting, or, any of us who've had kids, the difference between a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old in terms of how they can kind of follow rules and sit still and pay attention are significantly different. And so that's what's going on in this time period. And then the good news is there's another period of heightened plasticity for these skills in adolescence and early adulthood, which is when that part of the brain is sort of moving into its final formation. And so we have an opportunity, again, to build these skills with youth and young adults. We need to bring stress back into this story. So we were talking about sort of toxic stress and its effects in the biological systems. Stress also affects both the development and use of these kinds of capabilities. So for young children, going back to this idea of where the brain is building efficiency and reinforcing, if a young child is in a highly persistently stressed environment, it's going to be building stronger sort of capacities around automatic responses to sort of that stress. This is that red exclamation point. And therefore, the brain is not spending as much energy building more of those kind of intentional cognitive response kinds of capacities. So we need these things, right? It's good for survival and so on. But over time, those other skills are just not getting developed. And so over the life course, then if that in those early sensitive periods of brain plasticity, that child is building areas of capacity that it may not need or are less desirable over the life course in terms of skills and capacities for functioning. In adulthood, even if we've had sort of a well-balanced development of both our automatic and intentional kind of capacities, when we experience excessive and a lot of stress, it triggers our automatic responses. Again, fight, flight, that kind of stress response. And so again, it's overbalancing for us what we're drawing on to respond to a particular situation. I think all of us have probably had an experience where we're heavily stressed, we're in an emergency, some kind of crisis, and it's kind of hard to draw on those sort of intentional, planful kinds of skills and ways of responding and thinking. And so if adults are in these kind of constantly stressed environments, it makes it much harder for them to be able to draw on those kinds of intentional skills as that kind of automatic stuff is always sort of on, which makes it harder then to be a kind of focused and attentive parent, to do other kinds of sort of health-seeking behaviors and so forth. So we need to understand that even as we're building these capabilities and focusing on that, the effect that stress can have. And as we think about crisis environments and adversity, we need to be paying attention to the effects of stress, not just on young kids, but also on the adults who are in that environment. And so again, how are we looking at the kind of broader community and supports and services that can help both adults and kids manage and buffer the stress in that situation? And so these insights, these concepts, we can draw on sort of as guiding principles for how together we can work on building resilience for children and adults, even as they're facing the particular crises and challenges that we're focused on in this conference and in any other context in which we and others are working in terms of what adversity and challenges are facing kids and families. And so there are 3 principles. Again, I've been talking about these: building responsive relationships, adults and children, but also like service providers and adult caregivers. How are we sort of creating those kind of secure, responsive, supportive relationships? How are we really focused on ways to build those adaptive skills, these capabilities, through practice, through coaching, through support. And in whatever way we can, how can we be thinking about reducing sources of stress in kids and families' lives? Sometimes we can't, they're big stressors, climate change, but are there ways, in smaller ways, other kinds of day-to-day stressors that we could help relieve through community supports that just enable adults to be more attentive, have more capacity as caregivers, and give kids spaces to build those positive developmental things. So together, they work in an important way towards a set of outcomes, both for children in terms of their own healthy development and sort of achievement in learning, behavior, and in health, and in adults, both as sort of caregivers and in their own role as workers and citizens in society. And then let me close with a word about how these principles are, I think, highly aligned and can give us sort of some of the science story underneath the components of the nurturing care framework, which I know have been a really important step forward in how we can organize policies and programs and services for young kids in a variety of contexts with government, with international agencies, and with other partners. And so nurturing care is highly aligned with this science and is providing a framework of what a young child's brain and body need in terms of supporting healthy development. So the loving interaction and responsive care that we're talking about and how important that is for brain development and building those capacities and functions. I didn't talk as explicitly about the role that good health and good nutrition play in terms of how they are actually providing the nourishment and energy for building the brain, for building those skills. And the safety and protection that are so important to buffer against stress. And we know more and more about the interaction between kind of stress and nutrition and the ability of the body to absorb nutrients and so forth. And then finally, how access to early learning and good quality programs as really critical places where these kinds of skills and capacities can be built. And all of these working together for supporting and ensuring that children have an opportunity to grow up and have as positive a developmental pathway as we can do. So in closing, I encourage you, if you're interested, there is a lot more on our center's website on these and many other topics. And with that, I wish you a productive rest of this conference as you dig into these critical challenges and important issues for the well-being of kids and families in Asia and the Pacific and across the world. I hope that these insights and principles from the science and this frame of how we think about building resilience can be helpful in your deliberations. And I thank you very much.